getting on to the main topic here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Erik Kvale. Did I get that right? Great, awesome. So let me introduce him here. Erik retired as principal geologist in July of 2020 after nearly 14 years with Devon Energy in Oklahoma City. He joined Devon in 2006, and during his tenure with Devon, analyzed oil and gas deposits across the Midwest and Southwest U.S. Prior to Devon, Erik worked for the Indiana Geological Survey at Indiana University for 19 years as a research scientist. His focus was on mapping and field studies across the eastern U.S. Highlights of his Indiana University career include working with a group of astrophysicists to determine a way to use ancient tidal deposits to calculate past Earth-Moon distances. Okay. He has worked internationally and nationally. He has published, excluding abstracts, over 75 papers, maps, and guidebooks on a variety of depositional systems spanning fluvial to deep marine. More than half of these are in peer-reviewed international journals. Erik holds a PhD in geology from Iowa State University. Over the past 30 years, Erik has maintained an active research interest in the Bighorn Basin of northern Wyoming and has published a number of papers on his investigations there. In the course of this work, he discovered and named the Red Gulch Dinosaur track site near Shell, Wyoming in 1997. This is one of the most extensive dinosaur track sites in North America and one of the rare remains of Middle Jurassic dinosaurs in Wyoming. Working with colleagues at Dartmouth College, Kansas State University, University of Colorado Boulder, and the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, Erik had helped develop that Red Gulch Dinosaur track site into one of the most visited BLM educational sites in Wyoming. Presently, Erik is the president of the Bighorn Basin Dinosaur and Geoscience Museum, Board of Directors. The museum is actively working with the town of Greybull to create a dinosaur museum in Greybull that will focus on the amazing dinosaur and marine reptile remains that have been found in the Jurassic of Bighorn County. Please check out their website at bighornbasindinos.org. And I'll put that in the chat in a minute. Okay, with that.
All right, thank you.
Over to you, Erik.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, now make sure I get this going
yeah.
here.
Okay, so what you want to do is share screen.
Great.
And let's try that one. And how about you?
There.
So you can, okay.
I think it's going to work.
I think so. It's miracles never cease.
Miracles never cease, yeah. I have so many wires coming out of me. I haven't felt this wired since I was an undergraduate at finals time. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is I refer to as secrets of the Jurassic in the Bighorn Basin. This is really sort of a study of the background that goes into understanding dinosaurs and their habitats. And a lot of the information, I think, it was certainly when I first started looking at these rocks that I'm going to tell you about, I was shocked at what I was finding, and that it just conveyed to me the wide range of environments that dinosaurs during the Jurassic were able to inhabit on the planet. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a background in that and try to tell you why I think it's so amazing. Maybe I will. Okay, I think I'm in the wrong one here. Try this one. There we go. But I thought since I'm here in Jackson, I should probably at least show a photo of some of the local geology. This is 1976. This was a very fuzzy view of the Iowa State undergraduate field program. It was the year that I attended. The fellow on the right here is Dr. Carl Vondra. He was director for 40 some years. I was only the second director until I took over as director from him in the early 2000s for the Iowa State camp. It's a beautiful facility outside of Shell. It's about a $2 million facility, and it's one of the best undergraduate field camp programs in the country. And I have to say, this was the year that I discovered geology and realized that I didn't want to go to law school. I wanted to be a field geologist. So here's a blow-up view. I'm sure you can find the best looking guy in there, and that's me. I hope that's the one you guessed. So we'll just start with a couple of images. So this is artwork for the Morrison Formation and dinosaurs that were found. Is there any way I can get that? Getting the tops of the slides cut off here. Let me see here. I don't know if there's any way I can adjust the aspect ratio on that or not.
I think you can put the whole top thing on running down the side.
Oh, okay, that would be a good idea. Display settings, maybe that's it. Would this be it, do you think?
You gotta grab that toolbar and move it to the side.
Let's see here. Maybe someone with C. No. Oh, is anybody in the audience that wants to come up and give me a hand with this?
Is the slide not advancing?
It's advancing, but the top of the screen is being cut off.
Okay, so if you go, let's see. That, if you could get to those three dots at the top, if you look at the screen, she says more. See your cursor though.
No,
Is this a touch?
Oh, here it is, right there. Okay, now we got it.
More. And then go down to hide floating meeting controls. There.
Okay. See. Clearly, people in Jackson are much smarter than people in Shell.
Well, we've been doing this for years.
Okay, that makes me feel better. Okay, so this is a representation of the Morrison Formation done by artists 100 years apart. And you can see they're showing basically the same type of animals, these large sauropods, long-necked, long-tailed beasts. But you can see in the early 1900s, Charles Knight, working with paleontologists, their view of these large sauropods was that they were so massive that they couldn't support their own body weight easily on land. So therefore, they had to have spent most of their time in water. And because they were so massive, they had to have access to a lot of plant material, presumably aquatic material. And so these things, they look like a bunch of periscopes there. You can see in the background, if their little head sticking above water there. I've lost my mouse again, but so clearly these things were feeding on water plants. You can see that one fellow's got his head underwater. 100 years later, there was a much more radical view of what these animals look like. And here in the lower right, you can see some Diplodocus or Diplodocids, the Catodocus sieberi, and they're clearly mired in quicksand or mud in a dry river channel. Clearly, there had to have been a prolonged period of drought for that water hole to disappear like that. But in the background, you see those massive clouds suggesting that maybe monsoon rains are coming and there's about to be a catastrophic flood down that channel. So you've gone from almost an ever wet, continually swampy environmental interpretation for where these animals lived, and something that was much more different, more like the African savanna. And what was the difference? They had the same bones. They were basically looking at the same skeletons. The difference was the geology. So the geology that went into the study. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more about here. What kind of geology goes into the study? There we go. So I'm going to focus on the on the Jurassic period. We're going to encompass basically three formations: the Gypsum Spring, which is Middle Jurassic. It's the oldest Jurassic deposit we have in the Bighorn Basin. I show a formation called the Piper Formation. That's really a Montana term. In the Bighorn Basin, the Piper and the Gypsum Spring get lumped together. And then the Sundance Formation, and then very, very briefly talk about a couple of things in the Morrison. But I'm really going to focus on the Sundance and Gypsum Spring Formation. Just to orient you a little bit, the focus of my work has really been from north of Lovell up towards the Montana border, along the west margin of the Bighorn Basin, down towards Ten Sleep, just east of Worland there, and really that portion of the basin. Oblique Google Earth view, again, showing Greybull shell right here, and then RGDT is Red Gulch Dinosaur Track Site. So I did bring some pamphlets. We had written a pamphlet sort of explaining the geology and paleontology. If you ever get over there, it is an amazing area of dinosaur tracks. Covers about 3 square mile areas, and the part that's really been set aside by the BLM is quite well done. There's Sheep Mountain Anticline just to the north of Greybull. And the next slide, I'm going to show you all 3 of these Jurassic units in that next slide. That's that little yellow box up there. So here it is, the Triassic chugwaters to the right. Those are the big red beds, upper Triassic. And then actually we're missing the uppermost Triassic. That's middle Triassic. So there's a big gap. We're missing the upper Triassic and the lower Jurassic in the Bighorn Basin, at least up in Greybull Shell area. JGS is Jurassic Gypsum Spring. There's the JS, which is the Sundance Formation, the JM, which is the Morrison Formation. In that area, it's about 200 meters, 600 feet, and it encompasses about 54 million years. That's 1/3 of the amount of time that dinosaurs dominated planet Earth. So they're very significant units. Okay, so in order to understand the Jurassic, I thought, well, maybe we'd look at a movie, which is really kind of a stop motion animated version of Paleogeography. And some of you may be familiar with Ron Blakey's Paleogeographic reconstructions. Dr. Blakey is a now retired professor at University of Northern Arizona. He's not only a spectacular geologist, but he's a very decent artist. And Ron has put together sort of the most realistic versions of paleogeographic maps. They literally look like you're in a satellite looking down on the Earth with all the cloud cover stripped off. And so he's created these things. They're very popular. A lot of oil companies use them. People that are publishing in very site-specific areas because they look so realistic, and there's a great deal of science. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in time. We're going to watch this movie in reverse. The star there, which will either be yellow or black, represents the Greybull Shell area. So to the right of the star, you can see not getting this pointer here. You can see the Bighorn Mountains. To the south, the Owl Creeks. To the left of the star, the Absaricas. You can see the Black Hills off even further to the right there. So one of the things to look at is pay attention to what's happening to Florida as sea level goes up and down. You might also pay attention to where that star is relative to the 30° north latitude. 30° north latitude's significant latitude because it's referred to as horse latitude, and it tends to mark a zone of extreme aridity globally because of the Hadley circulation cells within the atmosphere. So that's an important sort of latitudinal position. You might also pay attention for the first few slides at just how much the continental ice sheets expand and contrast. And then as we get back in towards the Jurassic, you're going to see South America and Africa sort of come into play in a bit. So we're going to step back here. So this is present day. This is 11,000 years ago. This is towards the end of the last glacial max. You can see ice is up in the Great Lakes region. Here's our glacial max at about 21,000, our last glacial maximum. Ice extending all the way down into Indiana, Iowa, South Dakota, Kansas, and expansion of ice sheets in the Rockies. Here we are at the last major interglacial, the Sangamon, 130,000 years ago. Most of the ice has been melted off the continental shelf or the sheets, or I'm sorry, continental platform. You can see what Florida looks like. You know, people are concerned about global warming. You can imagine what Miami is going to look like at that point if it all melts. let's see here. Okay, Pleistocene, this is sort of the beginning of the last glacial cycles. You can see we're quite, I didn't mention, but the green tends to indicates the sort of wetter parts of the planet, or at least of North America. The browns are indicating drier zones. 5 million years ago, 10 million years ago, 20 million, 30 million, 35, 50, 55 were sort of, you can see the lakes here. Actually, I should have backed up a little bit more. Yeah, you can see the lakes there where the Green River beds were being deposited, all the beautiful fish that come out and fossils come out of the Kemmer area. Those are the Intermountain lakes there. Sort of beginning to form 55 million years ago. This is the beginning of Cenozoic, age of the mammals. 60 million years ago. You notice this hole down in the Yucatan. There's sort of a crater looking. That's the beginning of the Cenozoic. Here is the, oh, that was a bad day for the dinosaurs right there. 65 million years ago, that was the end of the Mesozoic and the beginning of the Cenozoic. Estimated size, about 9 kilometers, hit Mexico, resulted in 75% of all land and sea animals disappearing. I was surprised it was so small, but it was where it hit and the impact it had. Whoops. There we go. Okay, 67. Now we're at T-Rex time. T-Rex, Triceratops. And you notice that the mountain ranges are looking a little more subdued, the Rocky Mountains. And now pay attention to what happens to the Rockies and where the mountain fronts are as we sort of go back into the Cretaceous. We're still about the same paleolatitude that we are today. But you notice there's no continental ice sheets. Okay, here's the inland sea. This is the Skull Creek Seaway. There's the Skull Creek Seaway extending all the way through. Greybull Shell area, this would be Frontier Formation time, is now part of a delta complex. It sits on the east side of the western islands or western stretch of land separated from the eastern part of North America. 82 million years ago, 89. Okay, sort of the seaway sort of opening and closing. Here we are at 120 million years ago. We're now at the Cretaceous. The seaway has not quite encroached into North America yet. Where that yellow star is, those were actually large estuaries that had connected all the way up into Canada. That'd be part of the upper part of the Cloverleaf or basin part of the Sykes Mountain Formation, if you're familiar with that stratigraphy. Here we are 125 million years ago. This would be the time of Deinonychus, the raptors that chased the little kids through the kitchen in Jurassic Park. First ones, that would be the age. They were about a meter and a half high or so, maybe a meter high. This was the age of Deinonychus. You can see South America in the lower right-hand corner and the bulge of Africa sort of showing up on the right side there. Now watch this, as we go back into the Jurassic, watch how close that star gets to 30 degrees north. Okay, so we're now at the very early Cretaceous, beginning of the Cretaceous. Now we're into the late Jurassic. So we're now in Morrison time, 148 million years ago, very broad, flat, sort of coastal plain type setting, not a lot of relief. The mountains are way off to the west in Utah, Nevada, Idaho. We're getting closer to 30 degrees north. It's 154 million years ago. This was the end of the Sundance time. The Morrison deltas were starting to go north, forcing the Sundance Sea to retreat to the north. That's a tongue of the Sundance Sea. Here's the Sundance Sea now. You can see it's quite extensive. 165 million years ago, Sundance Sea, still in the middle Jurassic now. 167, middle Jurassic. You can see the Atlantic is just sort of opened at this point. 170 million years ago. We're now in the Gypsum Spring time, very close to that 30 degrees north latitude. Notice how dry it is. Pangea was just breaking up and very high pressure cells sitting over those large continental masses, which were further enhancing the aridity. 172. You can see that the Sundance Sea had just encroached and there was a very narrow neck to it right there in sort of western Montana. So a very restricted sort of seaway opening up into the beginnings of the Sundance Sea. Okay, now here we are in the very early Cretaceous, or I'm sorry, early Jurassic. We don't have any rocks preserved in the Bighorn Basin that are early Jurassic. But if you go to the southwestern corner of Wyoming and down into Utah, there are large aeolian sand dunes that have been preserved. And those are the Nugget Sandstone, the Navajo sand. Our area was probably a subtle topographic high and could have been the area that the sands were being whipped off of. So a lot of wind, the black arrow shows the paleo wind direction, erosion in our area, and then being deposited in that sand sea to the southwest. So I'm gonna, if I can here, you can see we're now south of 30 degrees north latitude. So let's see if I can, okay, we'll watch the movie forward now and I'll go through it fairly quickly. So the Rift Basin's opening up there to the east. Here we go. Sundance Sea is retreated. Okay, here's the Skull Creek Seaway, the Cretaceous, opening and closing, remnants of the Skull Creek Sea. Here we're now in the age of mammals, there are the lakes. Okay, back to present. Okay, reverse the movie and we'll get going here. I like watching the Caribbean. That's really fascinating how that's changed. Okay. Crash. All right, here we are. Actually, it wasn't a crash. It was a pulling apart. Okay, so first stop in our secrets of the Jurassic is going to be the Gypsum Spring Formation. And again, I just want to emphasize the restricted narrow seaway there, opening up in that allows the opening into a broader sort of shallow marine precursor to the Sundance Sea. And note the aridity indicated by Blakey's map. So the oldest deposit, the oldest Jurassic deposit we have in the basin is actually a gypsum deposit. And gypsum is a calcium sulfate, and it forms through the evaporation. When you get thick deposits of gypsum, specifically the alabaster form, it forms through the evaporation of seawater. And it's not present everywhere. It sort of comes and goes. It's thick enough. It's, I don't know, 20, 30 feet thick up towards level. U.S. Gypsum actually mines it up there. I think there are other gypsum mines maybe around Buffalo and elsewhere. But the way gypsum that thick forms is it has to have an access to seawater. So if you take a container of seawater and you evaporate it, the dominant salt that you're going to find in that container after the water is gone is gypsum, calcium sulfate. It's a hydrated calcium sulfate. The second one is sodium chloride. Okay, so in order to get these thick deposits, you have to have sort of a continual source of seawater coming into an almost entirely enclosed basin with high aridity and very high evaporation rates. And then at that point, the water is evaporating faster than new marine waters coming in. And so consequently, you get a lot of salts that can build up. So all of that that's labeled gypsum, it's stained red, but if I were to take a hammer like I did on the right side, I could put a white streak right up that side just by getting rid of the sort of red stain over the top. So where's a good example in today's world where we might find a sort of a barrier where high aridity and a almost enclosed basin? Well, it's Persian Gulf is where a lot of studies have been done, and it's a Straits of Hormuz is a very good analog for that sort of narrowing of during the Gypsum Spring time. And again, the black star is indicating the presence of Greybull and approximate location of Greybull and shell. So very high aridity. And the next slide I'm going to show you is Qatar there, that yellow box on the lower right. So here's a blow up of that satellite image, and it's just showing water salinities for the area around Qatar. Practical salinity units. So PSU for normal water is 35 PSU or parts per thousand. And that's just simply saying you have 35 grams of salt per kilogram of water. Okay, so that's what that is. And normal marine water is, like I say, about 35. So you can see on the north end there, let's see, I just can't get my, sort of the northwest coast of Qatar, you're getting the blue, which is approximating normal marine salinity. As you kind of sort of come down that embayment on the west side of Qatar, the salinity is increasing. And by the time you get to the south end, that salinity is so high, that's at the point where salt is starting to precipitate and being deposited on the seafloor. And this is important because if you sort of think about how the seafloor sediments are going to change as you sort of go down that embayment up to the north where that letter A is and where the blue is, you're probably going to find sort of marine carbonates, and they may be normal marine carbonates. They may have corals associated with them, maybe some sort of bivalves, some sponges, that kind of thing. And then as you sort of come in to that embayment, the salinity is going up. And so a lot of organisms can't tolerate hypersalinity, and so they start dropping out. But one of the organisms that can is calcium secreting algae or marine plants, certain marine plants. And what happens is that these things can grow in their sort of elevated salinities. And when they die, and if there's not a lot of wave energy or a lot of strong tidal influence, they can die and basically create this very fine grained carbonate mud. And so that's probably what's sort of accumulating towards the north end there, where you're sort of getting out of the blue and into the green. As you get down in towards the orange, you're going to start picking up salts on the seafloor. So calcium sulfate would be a logical one, some sodium chloride, and then some other minor salts that are coming in. So if you think about what that model would look like, is you're sort of moving from north to south down that embayment. I've drawn, there's a drawing on the right that sort of fits this model. You get carbonate muds in the deeper part where you get more normal marine salinity. As the salinity increases, the gypsum starts coming out. As you sort of get up into the intertidal zone, you're not going to have the volume to create big, thick salt deposits, but you can accumulate sort of muds. Maybe some of the silt is blowing in through wind, aeolian activity. But because you're in that intertidal zone, your water table is high. And so those mudstones tend to be green or very strongly reduced. You may have little nodules of gypsum that are growing in some of the void space. And then as you progress further up into the upper intertidal zone and into the supertidal zone, where you're not getting inundated very frequently, maybe there's floods coming out of the local highlands, comes in every 500 years, flash floods like they recently had in I can't remember if it's UAE or wherever, but they had some sort of catastrophic floods fairly recently, somewhere in the Persian Gulf. Those would be the sorts of things that would wash silt in, but because they're above the water table, when they dry out, they redden. So it becomes more oxidized. So the sequence would be carbonate muds, gypsum, greenish mudstones, and reddish mudstones, okay? And this type of depositional environment has a very specific name, and it's studied a lot, particularly by companies, oil companies, because of the potential for oil and gas accumulations. And they're called Sabkhas. It's an Arabic word. Classic examples are in the Persian Gulf. That's where a lot of the studies, very low relief area. So when you go from offshore to onshore, it's a very low gradient sort of profile, significant accumulations from evaporation, so the salts. Also, wind activity is very important. So wind can blow a lot of sediments in that ultimately get deposited on these systems. Okay. The Gypsum Spring is almost a laydown for that model. And you can see what I've drawn here, the red beds on the right is labeled TRC. That's chug water. So that's sort of middle Triassic. And then where the base of that first triangle is, that's the contact with the Gypsum Spring. So at that contact, there's the entire upper Triassic and lower Jurassic is missing. All that stuff got reworked by the winds and then deposited in those Aeolian sand dunes to the southwest. Okay, but once the sea level came back up high enough and we started getting tidal flat deposition, we start going through these cycles. Now, in some areas, like around Lovell, just north of Greybull, thick deposits of gypsum out towards Shell, up along the Bighorn Mountains. You don't really see a lot of gypsum here, but I can go just a little bit further north and the gypsum pops right back. And that may have something to do with coastline geometries. I'm not really sure. But you see these cycles going from sort of resistant limestone beds encased in green mudstones up to the red beds. Okay, and then sea level comes back up. You go back into the sort of limestones with the green mudstones, and then up into the next red bed. And then sea level comes back up again. And we go through at least 3 of those cycles right there. And so I've drawn it out on the bottom there. So the limestones and the greenish mudstones, those would be upper subtidal, maybe lower intertidal. Those would be the places that are inundated either continually or fairly frequently. And by the time you get up into the red beds, you're into either the upper intertidal zone or the supertidal zone, which gets inundated only during extreme tides, maybe wind-enhanced tides, that sort of thing. And Gypsum Spring is notorious for not producing fossils. And there's very, very few that have been found, particularly in the Greybull Shell area. Here's some examples of the most common ones that are found. The little bivalves in the lower right, they're all very small. They're all monospecies, Isocyprina. Obviously, they're associated with the limestone, so these sort of fine-grained muds. These little bivalves lived in those muds, probably filter feeders. Not a lot of wave energy. You know that because the valves, I've circled 2 where the valves are still attached, and these are very, very thin-shelled valves. So they haven't been reworked a lot. There's this concentration. Now, when you get a specific, monospecific sort of accumulation of one type of fossil, that usually means that that environment's very stressed. So that means there aren't a lot of organisms, like you can't bring in corals, you can't bring in other more robust bivalves because the water salinity is probably, and the temperature may be so extreme that only these little Isocyprina were able to survive. The other thing that we see is we see some invertebrate burrows, and I've shown some on the right. They're those vertical tubes. That's called Scolithia. And these are basically little vertical tubes. There may have been a worm-like organism that lived down in there. And when the tide would go out, or, well, in this particular case, wouldn't have been wave energy, but when the tide went out, they would have probably been somewhat exposed. And so when these organisms pop back down in their hole to try to retain the water, keep their bodies moist. And then when the tide came up, they could come back to the surface and maybe filter feed or go out and crawl around and find bits of organic material. So this is, again, telling us that they have a very sort of stressed environment. In this particular case, probably stressed by temperature and salinity and what the tide was doing at the time. Okay, so the fossils are indicating very stressed environment. And then we find these incredible features. So the photos at the top, I think, are from, let's see, Qatar, I believe, on these sort of intertidal flats. These intertidal flats have a lot of algae which accumulates on them. So the tide will come in, maybe deposit some carbonate mud. Tide goes out, the algae starts growing on it. If the tide stays out long enough and the air temperature is high enough, they start desiccating. And you create these incredible polygonal features. Water table can be very high, but they're subaerially exposed. So they're good indicators of subaerial exposures and very high temperatures. The lower example, lower left, that's an example from the Gypsum Spring. And so this was a loose slab. It had fallen down, so and it flipped over. So the photograph I'm taking there is like if I was one of those worms looking up at that slab, I would see the cracks that had been filled in by mud during the next tide that came in. So these are big desiccation cracks. And again, very common on these Sabkha environments. Repeated wetting and drying. And that would probably be, these would be good indicators of sort of intertidal positions. And the arrow here on the right is indicating that. Okay, some of the algae shows beautiful, fine little laminations. And again, this is consistent with what you'd find in the UAE at Abu Dhabi, Sabkha. Tide goes out. As soon as the tide goes out, the algae starts growing, gives sort of a greenish sheen to the surface. sort of forms this organic sticky cement. Next tide comes in, brings in more mud, it sticks. Tide goes out, algae starts growing again, comes in, goes out. Through these cycles, you end up creating these very fine sort of laminations that you can see here in this lower left photograph. Well, we see exactly the same sort of laminations here. You can see these very fine laminations coming through here on this carbonate. If you were to take this lower left photo and compress it, drive out all the water, it would look very much like this sort of feature in the upper right here. So again, sort of intertidal zones, carbonates, it's all consistent with these Sabkha very high energy or very high temperature environments. A lot of the red mudstones and the green mudstones, they'll have little gypsum nodules in it, and that's usually indicating you're still on that intertidal zone. Marine water's coming in, the groundwater is saturated, super saturated with salt, and so the salt starts coming out at that groundwater sort of air interface and starts creating sort of displaceably grown nodules of gypsum. The photo on the right is from Qatar. The photo on the left is from the Gypsum Spring with these beautiful little nodules of gypsum here. So again, probably sort of upper intertidal zone, very strong aridity, fitting this Sabkha model beautifully. So having said that, okay, you're in one of the most inhospitable places on the planet, right? Very high temperatures. You look around, there's not a lot to eat. There's a few scrubby brush, maybe here and there, but it's not a place where there's going to be a lot of organic plant material growing. You're not going to get a lot of bushes and that sort of thing. The water's hypersaline, so there aren't going to be a lot of fish that are going to be surviving in a place like that. And yet here we are looking at our intertidal carbonates, and we actually have dinosaur tracks in them. It's like, I was shocked when I found this. And here's an example of one of our better dinosaur tracks. And what kind of dinosaur is it? Okay, we're middle Jurassic. So there's some question. Okay. Was my cue to move it along. Okay, so we have a sinuous middle toe here. The toes are all going to points indicating claws. That's typical of what most paleontologists think of for meat-eating dinosaurs, okay? And the size of these things would have been dinosaurs that would have been about maybe emu to ostrich size, okay? So these were not big animals. Here's an example on the left with my boot for scale, sinuous middle toe, shorter outer toes, again, possible theropod. The problem is middle Jurassic, the theropod and ornithopod, which would be the plant-eating dinosaurs, they had similar foot structures, but most people, when they see these sinuous middle toes, they want to put it in the meat-eating category. Here's a trackway here that we mapped out. They have these sort of odd looks to them because it was a very sort of goopy substrate that they were walking on. So these tidal flats were mushy, so they were sort of sinking into the mud. So, despite the aridity and the salinity of the nearby seaway, tidal flat, the Gypsum Spring intertidal carbonates actually have dinosaur tracks in them. So, dinosaurs were living in deserts. So, completely different from that perspective, even the modern Morrison perspective, where there was a lot of vegetation, because you have to ask yourself, we have no skeletons of these animals. Skeletons have never been found in the Gypsum Springs. We barely find bivalves in there or even invertebrate burrows. So what in the world were these dinosaurs eating out there? Well, one thing that comes to mind, I mean, they could have been going offshore and they could have been swimmers. They could have been fishers. I mean, there are dinosaurs that have been interpreted to that. I think Spinosaurus is one. But I'm sort of intrigued with the possibility, because we have no skeletons, we can interpret it almost any way we want, right? Here's some flamingos out there filter feeding on the algae. One thing there is a lot of is algae. Could these dinosaurs have been filter feeding algae dinosaurs? Even though they have a foot structure that indicates theropod, is it possible? And so here's one of the secrets that's still out there in the Gypsum Spring. We don't know what kind of dinosaur could have lived in such extreme aridity, but they were there. We have tracks all over the place. In fact, that trackway, we have found those tracks in the Gypsum Spring from Ten Sleep all the way up to the Crow Reservation in Montana. So it's an extensive tidal flat where these dinosaurs are populating this area. Okay, not just dinosaurs. Some of our carbonates actually show these sort of odd arcuate features. And here's an example on the right, sort of paired arcuate features here. We see a whole series of them through here where the arrows are. We've actually interpreted these. They appear to be some sort of swimming crocodile. And I don't go into a lot of detail why we think crocodile rather than swimming dinosaur. But part of it is that they're arcuate. And so a crocodile, when it swims, it's got his arms out to and legs out to the side. A dinosaur, when it's going to swim, it's going to have its legs directly underneath it. And so they should be linear features rather than arcuate features. And so, again, we have no fossils, so we are certainly conjecturing. Okay, the second stop for secrets in the Jurassic, we're going to do the Sundance. And the Sundance Formation, when I discovered these tracks, and I say I was with a group of people, I just spotted the first track, so I was given the credit for it. This was the view I had when we went out on that surface, is that the Sundance was completely marine. And why would that be? Well, it's because Sundance is known for its marine fossils, and particularly its oysters and its squid-like animals called belemnites. So the oyster at the upper left, Gryphea, it's a filter feeder, had a keel like a boat, could sit in this sort of soft substrate and filter feed. These belemnites, squid-like animals, instead of 8 arms, they had 10, had little barbs on the end, and they're all over through the Sundance. All sorts of bivalves like this and squid-like animals. So imagine my surprise when we went out there and looking at a surface so I thought was going to be marine. And within 10 minutes, we were looking at dinosaur tracks of being on that surface. Very similar looking tracks to what we saw in the Gypsum Spring, about the same size animal, sinuous middle toe going to points, definitely would be theropod by most interpretation. However, we had more of these types of features, which have more bulbous toes, not necessarily the long sort of middle toe. These were starting to look more like ornithopods. So we don't know for sure because we haven't found the skeletal remains. It could just be the substrate consistency when these things walked. Imagine how different a cow's footprint could look as it goes through substrate that's dry versus very, very goopy. So it could be that we're looking at a theropod, but it was in a very muddy substrate. We just don't know. What we do know is that Red Gulch on this one surface, and this is part of the surface shown here, 800 tracks on that surface. I mapped in this area 3 square miles. In that 3 square miles, there was tracks on everything. And if you use the track density we see on this surface, there was over 1 million dinosaur tracks in place there conservatively in that area. Okay, so what kind of surface were they walking on? Well, this was the surface, what that looked like when we first walked out there. You can see what first attracted me is these linear features right here. These are ripples, the same sort of ripples that you would get along the coast of a beach. Okay, so as the tide is coming in, a little bit of wave energy reworks the sand into these nice sort of tightly spaced, low amplitude ripples, exactly what we're seeing on this surface. The other thing that intrigued me is these big circular features here, which I thought maybe could be modern erosional features. We didn't know what they were. We called them ABs for amorphous blobs. But when we started looking at the surfaces, we realized, no, they were actually formed shortly after deposition of that sand. And the orientation of these ripples indicates that seaward is in this direction. So we're on a tidal flat, very broad, low relief tidal flat, ripples coming in, much like up in the upper right, and offshore or deeper water would be to the upper part of this photo. In that true geographic sense, it was to the south, southwest. The sands are composed of the same sort of grains that you would see if you were to go to South Florida or the Bahamas. A lot of oolitic grains. These are little carbonate grains, almost form more in a sort of wave agitated area. I won't go into the dynamics on that, but it does require some algae to form these things. But if you go down again to the white sand beaches in the Caribbean or South Florida, this is the type of sand you're going to see. Those were the grains that we were seeing. So our analog in terms of sort of what the beach would have looked like would have been South Florida or the Keys. So this would be a view from Shell looking towards Greybull back 167 million years ago. Okay, so obviously we got all excited about this. Got a contract with the BLM, did the science on it. One of my colleagues, Gary Johnson, is a professor at Dartmouth College. He had a whole group of students out there one year. And so he had them measure a very large area where he had them drawing everything on a 1 meter square grid. So he drew in all the ABs, the amorphous blobs as of the dashed circular features, had the little vertical traces. I'll show you some in a minute maybe. These are, again, these scolithos type traces we have in the Gypsum Spring. And then our dinosaur tracks, you strip out everything but the dinosaur tracks. And north is indicated in the lower right there. All of these animals are walking to the south, southwest towards deep water. All of them were, with the exception of an odd one or two. One of our bigger ones, he's sort of walking somewhat away from the deeper water, but all of them, and again, about emu to ostrich size, in that 3 square mile area, the dominant trend was to the south, southwest. Okay, so what were the amorphous blobs? Well, we actually got the BLM to pay for a trip to South Florida so we could look at the analogs. And yeah, no. Thank you very much as a taxpayer. When we got down there, we were shocked because we went to Fort Myer first and with a group of students from Dartmouth. And as we were there, the tide was going out. Of course, you had all the beachcombers, right? Beachcombers were out there. Dogs were running around with their owners. There were large shorebirds that were out there. And if the organism, the animal, the person was big enough, they would actually punch through that sort of surface. And you see that surface has kind of a greenish tint to it. As the tide was going out, the green became more intense. It was basically algae growing on that tidal flat. And sort of a muddy, sandy mixture. But as the tide was going out, algae was growing, and then the tide would come in, tide would go out, more algae would grow. And if an animal or a person had walked on that surface, it actually could create a fairly thick algal mat. But if a person came out, stepped on it, punched through that thing, the next tide that came in, if it had any sort of wave activity with it or any sort of energy, would rip that place up right where that puncture had happened and float it off. And then you're exposing sand with no algal cement to it or no organic cement. And as a consequence, you start forming ripples. So we realized that our ABs were actually, could have been originally dinosaurs walking out on this tidal flat. Tide came in with a little bit of wave energy to it, ripped it up, floated them off. And then the next generation or next, tidal cycle, another pack of dinosaurs or herd of dinosaurs came in, and they were the tracks that were preserved. So lower right there, the diagram labeled C, you can see an AB with a dinosaur track right in the middle. So multiple generations of dinosaur tracks. In terms of environment, we have a very strong paleoclimate indicator. These little cubes are showing up all over the track-bearing surface. These cubes are hopper casts. These are basically salt crystals that have grown quite large. And again, where do you get salt crystals growing? Someplace where you have very high evaporation and high temperature. So again, we're talking about dinosaurs that lived in a coastal environment, much sandier, much healthier environment in terms of offshore marine, not hypersaline, but saline enough that these tidal flats and the temperatures were high enough that when the groundwaters were evaporating, they were leaving behind these hopper casts of salt. So again, dinosaurs living in an arid environment. So when you look at these sorts of diagrams and you think about, you look at the diagram, you go, wow, that's a really cool dinosaur. Do what I do and look at the background, because that background is going to give you a great, if it's drawn accurately, it's going to give you a great deal of information about the sort of environment that these dinosaurs lived in. Now that drawing on the lower left is actually from Howe Dinosaur Quarry. It's one of our Morrison quarries just north of Shell. And again, you can see evidence of aridity. The channel is dry. The allosaurs are out there plucking off the baby dinosaurs. Sauropods are bogged down in quicksand or mud. The pterosaurs are out flying around looking for scraps. The photo I showed you at the very beginning of that reconstruction showed a monsoon coming in. So I like this, walking with dinosaurs living in the Arctic, or Aurora Borealis, and snow on the ground. So our view of these dinosaurs has changed significantly in the last 100 years. But really, it was even up into the 80s when a lot of paleontologists thought these large sauropods still lived in these swampy environments. It wasn't until the geologists started getting more involved in the studies. Okay, so let me back up here. So the difference between a good dinosaur study and a drawing and a great dinosaur drawing and study is in the background. So you can tell how much geology has gone in by looking at the background. And I'm going to add that when you go to a museum, how many of you have been to a museum where you go in and it's like a police lineup of dinosaur bones or fossils of some sort, where they're all lined up in shelves? They, especially in small town museums, you go in, there'll be a big dinosaur femur and it'll just say dinosaur bone. No indication of its age, where it was collected, anything about the animal at all. The skull, mammal skull after mammal skull, sometimes they're labeled, sometimes they aren't, sometimes they're labeled incorrectly. You walk away going, my gosh, those are fantastic fossils. But what do you know other than the fact is that you saw some really cool fossils? That's the difference between a good museum and a great museum. And what I'm doing, and I actually have another board member, Nolan O'Neill, his wife, Denise, in the back. We're part of a board that is, a few years ago, decided we wanted to start telling the story of the dinosaurs in our area and the fantastic geology that we have that supports an understanding of these animals. And so we've actually set up an agreement with the town of Greybull to build an extension, not an extension, but a separate dinosaur building. So they're going after the funding for the building. Our board is actually going after the fossils that are going to go in that. And it's going to be small. It's going to be relatively small, a little over 3,000 square feet, but we're going to focus on just on the Jurassic and our spectacular dinosaurs. Well, why do we want to do that? Because we have produced our area some of the most iconic dinosaurs found anywhere in the world. You're probably familiar with Big Al 2. It's the world's most complete Allosaurus skeleton found anywhere. It's only missing a bone or two. It's now on display at the University of Zurich. It was originally at the Sarrier Museum in Switzerland. It was collected by Kirby Sieber, a Swiss paleontologist. The only place you can see Big Al 2, the original fossils, is in Switzerland. Now, there are casts of Big Al 2 running around. I think the Thermopolis Dinosaur Center has one, but the original fossils are no longer in North America. Big Al, which before Big Al was found before Big Al 2, at that time it was the most complete. But there's pathology on both those allosaurs. Big Al 2 looks like it was smacked on the side by the tail of a large sauropod, perhaps protecting itself or protecting its young while Big Al 2 was trying to attack it. The injury's actually healed, but it could have been part of the reason why Big Al 2 eventually died. Nobody talks about that in any of the displays. I've seen Big Al 2 on display in 2 different areas. They just talk about Big Al 2, talk about a complete sauropod, but they don't tell you the story about Big Al. Big Al 1 has a lot of similar pathologies, broken bones that have healed, arthritis. And again, it sort of gets into this story about allosaurs, and allosaurs seem to have actually maybe could have been like wolves and sort of fought within a pack. It's just all part of the story that rarely gets told when you just see a display like you see on the right there. We also produced in our area at the Howe Quarry, this famous quarry north of Shell, Catodocus seaberi. It's a diplodocid, one of these long-tailed, long-necked dinosaurs. It's the first time frills had ever been found on the back of a dinosaur. So this was significant. A brand new genus. Manuel Schaap, professor at University of Hamburg, is one who described it. Catodocus seaberi is also in Switzerland. The Swiss paleontologist, Kirby Sieber, now has one of the best, if not the best, dinosaur museum in Europe. His collection and his museum started in the Howe Quarry, just north of Shell. Here's a Camarasaurus, world's most complete Camarasaurus. I think it was 95% complete. One of these very large sauropods. It's now on display at the Fukai Prefectural Dinosaur Museum in Japan. Never been a cast made of it, as far as I know. It's the only place you can find it is in Japan. That came out of quarry, Red Canyon Quarry, again, just north of Shell. Sarah, perhaps you've heard of Sarah, renamed Sophia, sold for several $1 million, is now on display at the London Natural History Museum. World's most complete Stegosaurus, was actually found with the tail spikes attached or in a attached position. Very rare for a Stegosaurus to actually have that. That's Bob Simon, working with Kirby there, doing the excavation on it. Did you know that there's only one allosaur nest found anywhere in the world, and it came from just east of Greybull? The only allosaur nest anywhere in the world. We found it on an expedition that I was leading with some USGS folks. It was a person who was an eggshell expert that was on that USGS crew, and he was the one who spotted the first eggshell. We turned it over to the Smithsonian. Smithsonian came out and did a complete excavation, spent about 2 years doing the excavation. And the only allosaur displayed anywhere in the world in an egg-laying position over an allosaur nest is in the Smithsonian. We plan to be the second one. Now, this allosaur, the problem with this, it looks like the allosaur laid it on laid its nest on a sidewalk in New York. This is what the nest actually looked like. So what the Smithsonian has a problem. They have 7 million people that come through there. You know, their biggest problem is dust. Can you imagine all the dander and skin and fibers coming off of 7 million people? That's why they show their nests laid on a sidewalk, and they use a lot of these panoramic views. And so this is what that allosaur nest looked like based on their excavation and the geology that I helped them out with. So we want to be only the second museum in the world to display an allosaur nest. It came from our area. So we're working with the Smithsonian on that, and they're giving us casts of those eggshells or the eggs themselves. And so that's going to be one of our displays. The other thing that's never told or rarely is told is the history of the discoveries. So this is the American Museum opened up the Howe Quarry just north of Shell back in the 1930s. And they operated the quarry from 32 to 34. In 1934, they pulled something like 1,000 dinosaur bones out, enough to fill a railroad boxcar. The person that's given credit for that discovery is this chap, a very dapper looking chap in the bow tie, Barnum Brown. Now, Brown was this dynamic person. He was a smoker, a drinker, a gambler, a noted ladies' man. He was also the person who found and named the very first Tyrannosaurus Rex. He influenced a huge number of paleontologists. Even paleontologists today are inspired by that guy. I was hoping that actually Harrison Ford was going to be here. I don't see him in the audience. And I was going to say, this guy probably as much as Roy Chapman Andrews served as a sort of model for the Indiana Jones. He actually worked as a spy and an oil explorationist. So, I mean, the guy had this incredible life, lived into his 90s. His wife was like 30 years his junior. Here he is in the field in a mink coat. I mean, how many people go to the field in a mink coat and bow tie? I mean, that's a story that needs to be told about these. And these bones are all shipped back to the American Museum. We've actually talked with the American Museum. We have established a really good relationship. When he said, they have very few of these bones, all these 1,000 bones, very few of them have been cleaned, even prepped or even described. They've only recently started that process. And we said, can we get some of those original bones back? And they said, if you can pull this museum off, they said, we'll talk to you. So we're very optimistic that we can get some of our bones back. So what are the benefits for Greybull? Well, educational benefits are, that seems fairly obvious. If you can get a good science museum set up or dinosaur museum that talks about paleoclimate, ecology, depositional environment, you hit a lot of the STEM sort of things. There's a famous paleontologist named Bob Bacher who wrote a groundbreaking book that sort of broke open the new science of paleontology called The Dinosaur Heresies in the 1980s. He says, if you want to get somebody interested in science, he says, you can talk about astronomy, you can talk about death, you can talk about sex, or you can talk about dinosaurs. And so, you know, we could talk about death and sex and dinosaurs and even throw in a little astronomy if we do the right units in the Sundance. So that's a big part of what we want to do is the educational benefits. The other thing is community enhancement. So the American museums, they were producing so much material and it became so famous that the Hollywood, there were reports on what was coming out of that quarry that were being published all over the world. Hollywood actually sent a movie crew out and they did one of these movie tone reels. They're oftentimes shown before major events or major movies. And they came out and filmed that. Well, Greybull obviously took notice. And for about 20 some years, Greybull Junior High School was known as the Greybull Fighting Dinosaurs. And you can see where the inspiration, Sinclair funded the American Museum for those dinosaur expeditions, not just for Hal, but for some other ones. That's where Sinclair got its dinosaur logo from, is from the funding of the American Museum and the success of Barn and Brown. You can see that the logos are virtually a knockoff. We like to think in Greybull that Sinclair took our version, but my bet is that it didn't go that way. Economic benefits. Greybull is, like many small Western towns, is dying on the vine. And yet there were 3.3 million tourists that visited Yellowstone. Now, Greybull is actually on US 14 and 16, one of the major routes that feeds people into Cody and ultimately the eastern entrance and even coming out. There's one intersection where Greybull has a stoplight. So if assume that maybe 10% of that 3.29 million people went through Greybull stoplight, if you could get 25% of those people to stop and spend on average $5, that would be a huge economic boost for Greybull. So there's another reason why we're trying to promote this idea. We also have good connections through my research and family history with the American Museum of Natural History. They've been willing to work with us to repatriate some of our fossils that came out of the original Hal Quarry. We have good working relationships with the Smithsonian. I've turned over two finds to them, one the Red Gulch track site as well as the eggshell site. So, and I've worked with their paleontologists to helping them understand some of their geology and the context. So the time is ripe for Greybull to make this move. So this is just kind of a summary of some of the things that we hope to put into our museum. Starting with the Middle Jurassic Gypsum Spring, we have dinosaur tracks to tell a story about. Incredible aridity, the Persian Gulf analog, our swimming crocodiles. We go up into the Sundance. I haven't talked about the pterosaur tracks we found. There were pterosaur tracks found up around level. These are these flying reptiles. We have this incredible marine reptiles that have been found, the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. One of the plesiosaurs found in our area actually had they think the plesiosaur died giving birth to its young. They had eggs that hatched internally because they were reptiles. They lived in the water, so they would hatch internally and then they would give live birth to these animals. Actually, one of those skeletons was found in our area. We have dinosaur tracks from the the Sundance Formation. And then, of course, all of our iconic fossils. We have dinosaur tracks and our dinosaur nest up in the Morrison. So we have more than enough to tell a quality story in a relatively small museum. So that's kind of my sales pitch, I guess. Going around trying to promote the idea and just get people interested. So the more talking that we can get within the state, I think the better off our chances are for getting funding coming down the pike, both to build quality displays as well as put up a quality building. So if you have a cell phone, you want to scan that, that'll take you to our website. This will also take you to the Red Gulch Dinosaur Track site and gives you some geologic information. I did bring a handful of pamphlets on the Red Gulch, so if you want, please feel free. And I'm happy, it was a bit of a long spiel, but thank you for your patience and happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
What's the primary production that's supporting all those animals, like in that upper drawing? I don't get it.
Well, they probably added a few.
So, just for the Zoom audience, if you could repeat the questions.
Oh, okay.
Great.
So the question is on the upper right, that Morrison reconstruction, what was the primary production that supported all those animals? Did I get that correct? So the best analog for the Morrison is probably the African savanna. And so you have large herds of elephant, zebra, things like that. So they have plants that they could eat. Okay, now they may have shown a higher density than actually existed. I think there have been some predator-prey relationships that have been studied. And I think they sort of fit with the African savanna with predators and prey relationship there. So the sauropods would have been plant eaters. Of course, the allosaurs would have been meat eaters. So the lions and the elephants or giraffes. Yeah.
But those illustrations are not to say they were normally always concentrated that way, but does that relate to some of those finds where they will happen to be concentrated?
Yeah, so maybe you've seen videos where there were wildebeest trying to cross flooded rivers, and all of a sudden the wildebeest just get swept down in mass and get piled up. You know, that's one possible explanation for why you get so many dinosaurs sort of piled up in one area. The other one is, again, water holes, strongly arid environment or seasonally arid. They sort of congregate in a water hole. They either die from lack of water, die from lack of food, or they get mired in quicksand or mud. And so you get large accumulations like that. A lot of that inspiration has sort of come from studying the African savanna. But in the Howe Quarry, for instance, it appears that they got stranded there. There were some sauropods that basically looked like the animal collapsed right down over their feet, which appeared to be mired in mud. And then a big monsoon came in and started sweeping some of the bones downstream. And so a combination of maybe dying because of drought and then being dispersed because of monsoonal floods. Yeah.
Could you go back to the Trackway and you made a comment that said, you showed a picture of the flamingos and the filter feeders, the filter feeding the algae.
Yeah.
Why would meat-eating theropods be going seaward? Talk a little bit more about what you're thinking.
Okay, so the question is, what is a meat-eating dinosaur doing in a Sabkha? Basically, is that sort of a synopsis? I don't know. I don't know. Well, the speculation is that it was an extremely arid environment, and as far as I know, nobody has sort of started. I'm sure there's been a lot of people conjecturing over a beer at a bar someplace, but I don't know. I mean, I have not talked to a single paleontologist that sort of understands that arrangement. I mean, it's like secrets of the dead, It's like, why are these guys out there? And so what are their possible food sources? Well, in that type of environment, if they went offshore into normal marine salinity or maybe, somewhat elevated salinity, there could have been certain organisms, fish, whatever, that could have come in there. So they could have been fishers.
Shrimp. Brine shrimp.
The question is brine shrimp, but we don't see any evidence. Well, brine shrimp certainly in the water column, but we don't see any evidence of a lot of inorganic or organisms in the mud flats. So we have little worms, and we're not seeing the big burrows that would be associated with like full-blown shrimp. So yeah. So I don't know. Maybe we need to have a beer and talk about it.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Question. I think it was around that same time you showed trackways where 90% of the tracks were headed toward the ocean.
Yes.
Why didn't they go back? They just went toward the ocean and then happened.
It could have been. The question is, why do so many of our Sundance tracks go towards the ocean and we're not seeing a big trackway headed back? So part of it could just be exposure. We just need to strip off some of the sagebrush, get a good Zamboni out there and sweep it off. And we might be able to find where they went into the water and then came back out. The two areas that were most extensively exposed, that were studied in the most detail, the dominant tracks seem to be going to the west, the southwest, southwest. They may have gone offshore, caught the longshore currents, and then headed back in someplace. Maybe their bodies are, I don't know. We don't really know why. I was intrigued, Michael Fay, when he did his grand transect across Africa, he ended up walking across Africa And he actually got to West Africa, and I think he witnessed hippos body surfing. And they thought the reason was because they were getting parasites off their bodies. So, who knows? Again, another secrets of the dead. We don't have any body fossils. And so it's very hard to sort of come to those, draw firm conclusions based on tracks. Yeah.
Since you did the pitch,
how
much are you looking to raise?
So our basic budget for displays within our museum was $400,000. And as we've sort of gone through this, that was going to get us the world's most complete baby sauropod called Baby Tony, stands about that tall, probably a baby Diplodocus. We wanted to get Big Al, too, world's most complete allosaur. We wanted to get the nest. We wanted to get Sarah, the world's most complete Stegosaurus. And we hope to get one of these really complete long-tail, long-necked dinosaurs. The problem is every year we wait, the price goes up. So the idea is we want to get quality displays to support the animals. So $400,000 would get us off the ground. And then the town of Greybull is applying for grants to the state, SLIB grants. And we hope that we get those in place. They're probably, Nolan's been involved more in some of the financing on that, but they're probably looking at 400,000, don't you think, Nolan, for the building? Yeah. So we're talking probably by the time we get things to the way we want them, we're probably talking about $1 million. Right now, we launched our capital campaign in December, and we are just now starting to go outside of the town. And just on our online presence, we've raised over 150,000. So we've done pretty well in a short term, but we're trying to get the word out for anybody that's interested. Naming rights are still available.
Thanks. Just come in. So we do have some questions. Let me come here.
Sure.
We do have some Zoom questions. I'm going to just stand here so I can
absolutely.
just tell the Zoom audience as well. So why are dinosaurs found in Wyoming and less so in other parts of the U.S.? Aside, whoops, whoa, hang on a minute. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my Zoom. Okay, so sorry, why are dinosaurs found in Wyoming and less so in other parts of the U.S. aside from Western Colorado, Utah?
Okay, so that's a good question. So you find dinosaurs where you have rocks preserved that are the right age. So for instance, in Indiana has no Mesozoic rock preserved. It's all Paleozoic. So the whole period of dinosaurs surely lived in Indiana, what's now Indiana, and Illinois, but there are no rocks that were preserved there of that age. So dinosaurs live probably all over the world, but are preserved only in specific environments. So if you think about, what is the chance that a bighorn sheep is going to be preserved for posterity 50 million years from now? Well, not much, because they live in mountains. Mountains are zones of erosion. The erosion would carry any sort of carcass away, and it wouldn't be preserved. Now, if that bighorn sheep lived in the Gulf of Mexico, right on the Mississippi Delta, his chances of preservation, because very high sedimentation rates, would be greatly enhanced. So our rock record is actually biased by dinosaurs that live in coastal areas where there was high sedimentation rates or low relief areas. We probably have no idea what dinosaurs that lived in mountains look like.
One more Zoom question. Thank you. And actually, there are two more. Are most of the dinosaur? Not sure I understand.
Are most of the dinosaur finds from Wyoming, and are most of them now gone to other museums? Did Wyoming keep any of the finds? Yeah, all of the stuff from our area has gone away. I mean, they're probably in the University of Wyoming. There are small sort of collections of dinosaurs. But for instance, Big Al went to Montana, Museum of the Rockies. Wyoming just hasn't had the sort of paleo programs and the facilities to be a large repository for large numbers of dinosaurs like these. And so while surely there are some in their collection, they have to go, if they're found on federal land, they have to go to nationally recognized repositories that can study them and take care of them. And so federal finds have ended up in Smithsonian or other major museums around the US. Things that are found on private land, they can go anywhere that the landowner and the collectors want them to go. And so a lot of times these things are found by private collectors who are looking for complete fossils, and they will sell them to the highest bidder. Sarah went for, I don't know how many millions of dollars. I think there was a stand, not even complete T-Rex that sold for 32 million, I think. It was sold by the Black Hills Institute. So it can be big money for some people. Did your examination of the Florida mud algal flats correlate at all with your research on tidal flat deposition and Earth-Moon distance? Not really. That research would be a whole nother topic of conversation. I noticed in my introduction that one of my claims to fame is that I have probably the only geology paper on repository at the Kinsey Institute for study of sex and gender. And that would be a whole nother talk. So no, the answer to that question is no. Florida didn't offer me a lot of insight into Earth-Moon distance. That was a good question, though. Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your patience.
Well, guys, I didn't mention this earlier, but I did want to really thank Erik for driving here from Shell Greybull over the Togety Pass in a huge snowstorm. So if anybody in Zoom is wondering why I'm wearing a winter sweater, it's because it is still winter here.
And I did it in a Ford Focus.
Not an easy feat. So thank you again, Erik. And here is a little gift and
appreciate it very much.
Token of our appreciation.
Well, thank you very much. And if any of you have any questions about the Dinosaur Museum, you can contact us through our email, which is on our website. Those in the audience here, another one of our board members is here, so we're happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.